Okay, good morning. So, what I'd like to do this morning is a little bit esoteric, a little bit mystical, a little bit philosophical. We're going to endeavor our best to package it in a language that we can all understand and appreciate. So the context of what I want to share with you is the fact that in 3 weeks is going to be the 10th of Shvat. And the 10th of Shvat is a very big and significant day in Chabad because it's the day that in 1950, the previous Chabad Rabbi passed away and the mantle of leadership transferred from the previous Rabbi to the Rebbe. So essentially it marks the day when the Rebbe begins his leadership, and what we know about Chabad today worldwide and the revolution of Chabad says and the ideas that Chabad shares really begin 75 years ago as the Rebbe takes the mantle of leadership on the 10th of Shvat. And therefore it's a significant day, celebrated in Chabad and so on. Now, the Rebbe had a custom every year on the anniversary of this day to teach a particular section of a particular discourse of his predecessor, the previous Rebbe. So just to explain very briefly, the previous Rebbe towards the end of his life was not speaking. He was only writing and publishing his writing. So in advance of occasions, he would write some sort of teaching, give it to the publishers, and ask them to publish it on a certain occasion. So what happened was the previous Rebbe had written a 20-chapter discourse to be published on the 10th of Shvat, which was Shabbat that year, and he ended passing away on that day. So essentially he had published a teaching in anticipation almost of his own passing. I mean, that wasn't officially why he was doing it. He was doing it to honor his grandmother's yahrzeit or his mother's yahrzeit coming a few days later. And but nonetheless, it became like the last will and testament of the previous Rebbe, this 20-chapter discourse, and it was studied thereafter in that context. So every year, what the Rebbe would do is the Rebbe would deliver a discourse expounding on one chapter of the 20 chapters. So in 1951, he delivered a discourse explaining chapter 1, 1952, explaining chapter 2, 1953, explaining chapter 3, and so on and so forth. And in the 40 years of the Rebbe doing this, the Rebbe had gone through 2 cycles of explaining each of the 20 chapters. So that 20-chapter discourse, with all of the Rebbe's explanations, ended up becoming 2 full volumes. Okay? So in continuing that tradition, every year, Chabad Chassidim all over the world study that particular chapter relevant to that particular year with the explanations that the Rebbe had given throughout the years. Right? So this year, thousands of Chabadniks and Jews all over the world are studying chapter 15 of the previous Rebbe's discourse, along with the Rebbe's explanations that come in the years 1965 and 1985, 20 years apart. So what I'd like to do today is to give an overview and a little bit of a taste of what is discussed in this chapter 15 that everybody in Chabad is busy studying and trying to understand. A little overview of what the chapter is all about and the message and main takeaway of that teaching. So some context. Let's give an overview of the 20 chapters and where chapter 15 fills in. Are we clear so far on what we're doing? Good? Okay. So the 20-chapter discourse essentially discusses the following. It opens up with a verse in which God says, I'm coming to my garden. I'm coming back to my garden. It's a verse from Song of Songs, which is a love letter, really, between God and the Jewish people, using the metaphor of a romantic relationship between a man and woman. And the man, God says, I'm coming back to my garden to see my bride. So I'm coming back to my garden to see my bride, which is essentially God saying, I'm coming back to my garden to be with the Jew. That's the verse. So the Midrash notes that the verse states, I'm coming to my garden, not I'm coming to the garden, implying that the place of God's meeting with the Jew is already God's place, but for some reason he's coming back. Which therefore implies, says the Midrash, that initially God's presence was on earth, and then through generations of sin, beginning with Adam who ate from the tree of knowledge, God's presence was banished from the earth, and then through the Jew doing what he has to, specifically the Midrash notes 7 generations beginning with Abraham down to Moses, and Moses building the temple, like the temporary temple, the Mishkan that was in the desert. We're re-inviting God back into the earth. And that's God returning to his garden to be with his people. And that model of God being removed from the earth by sin and then being reintroduced by our service of God, that model repeats itself throughout history. And that's essentially the theme of the 20-chapter discourse. More specifically, to give us context to chapter 15, the previous Rebbe goes on to say, well, if the Mishkan, that temporary temple that Moses built in the desert, was the home that the Jews invited God back into his garden, into the world, then we have to look to the Mishkan to get an idea of how we would re-invite God into our world and what was done there. And he highlights a number of things that happened in the Mishkan and how we derive from that our lesson, how we re-invite God into our life and to our world. For the purposes of our discussion today, I'll highlight one. The previous Rebbe notes that the beams that were used for the walls of the Mishkan, of the temple in the desert, was made of cedar wood or acacia wood. The Hebrew word for acacia is shittim. That's the Hebrew word, shittim. This word shittim comes from the same root word, which means shtut, foolishness, silliness. So explains the previous Rabbi, these atzei shittim, these shittim acacia trees, represent this notion of taking the silliness of the world and using it in holiness. In simple terms, what that means is the attitude of being, I'm a go-getter, I do what I want, and I'm a conqueror, and I do. This is like this, not like the methodical, disciplined way of behaving. That would be, the straight and narrow. The shtut, the silliness, is to go beyond that and to push yourself beyond the limits of the straight and narrow. And I'm going to conquer, I'm going to achieve, and just tweak that to be used for, I'm going to serve God no matter what happens, even if it's not so neat, not so clear, and things look like there's obstacles, I'm going to go and do it anyway. So you're taking the attitude of really, it's American entrepreneurship, if you want to call it that, and using it in the service of God. That kind of, instead of taming it and saying, okay, don't be so sillily running after all these things. Be disciplined, do what you have to. Instead of doing that, the previous Rebbe is suggesting, no. Take that attitude of, I want to go get and do everything, even though it's beyond the simple and the disciplined and the narrow, and use that in holiness. And that's represented by the beams, the walls of the Mishkan that are made of acacia wood, which in Hebrew is the word shittim, come from the word shtut. We're taking the shtut of klipa, the silliness of this world, and using it for shtut diktusha. That's the term, shtut diktusha, holy silliness, holy commitment that goes in beyond the straight and narrow of the disciplined person. That's the context. Then he continues and says, doing that is a very big battle. Internally, to be able to battle my personal desires that veer from the straight and narrow and then redirect them to be serving God that veers from the straight and narrow is a very serious inner battle. Now, which is why when the Jewish people leave Egypt to go build this temple, they're referred to as Tzivot Hashem, the legions of God, legions as an army, tzava, tzivot. So the Jews are referred to as an army as they leave Egypt, going to build this temple, because in order to indeed bring God into our lives, and especially if I want to take that attitude that veers from the straight and narrow and make it veer from the straight and narrow in the positive, it takes a lot of inner struggle. It's really a battle. Now, when we're talking about a battle, says the previous Rebbe, there are different types of battles. There are some battles, literally wars. There are some wars in which the objective is you want to gain something. So the enemy has some sort of resource that you want to get. So you go. Of course, no countries ever do that. But you invade some other country because they have oil or whatever. They have some other resource and you want to go get it and you take it back. Okay. Or you want to expand the territory of your country or whatever it is you want to achieve. If that's the nature of the war, then before you start, you have to ask yourself how much could be gained, and you'll only spend that much, which is going to yield a profit. You're not going to spend more than what you're going to gain. So if the war is going to cost you, $100 billion, and all you're going to get out of it is $50 billion, that was a waste. Right? So if the objective of the war is to gain something, then you have to measure your expenditure based on the gain. Otherwise, what's the point? But then there are certain battles that are existential in nature. If I lose this battle, I'm no longer me. We're no longer a country if we lose this battle. When that's the case, there's no cost or price you're going to put on that battle. Whatever we have, we're going to expend. The analogy continues in the previous Rebbe's teaching that the king, leader of the army, collects treasures for generations. And usually treasures that the king has, there are different types of treasures. Some treasures are displayed on museums, and some are behind lock and key and never get seen. They're not even displayed on museums because, I don't know, there's some ancient artifact that he got from his great-great-great-grandfather or his king also, all these kinds of fancy things. So usually these things are not used, they're hidden. But if the king's realm is threatened to the point where either the king is king or is not king, then everything's on the table. And if we need to spend that treasure that we've collected for generations and that's what we need to win, we're going to splurge it happily because the very kingdom is threatened. Therefore, says the previous Rebbe, this question of whether God's going to be in our life or not in our life, whether our world is going to be a home for God or not a home for God, that comes down to the very core of what God wants. And therefore, God is willing to, as it were, splurge the deepest truths and secrets and treasures of himself for the sake of the success of this inner battle that we're facing. Okay? Now, in that context, comes this year's chapter 15, to explain what exactly is this treasure that God is concealing. And now, because we're at this battle where we have to fight for our identity as Jews, are we going to be enthusiastically about ourselves, the silliness of the world, or are we going to be enthusiastically for God, the silliness of Kedusha, of holiness? That question which comes to the core of, is God king or not? God's willing to spend even the deepest treasures. So what exactly is that treasure? That's the next part of the discourse which we focus on this year. We clear so far? We're building. Okay. In order to explain and understand what exactly this deep treasure that God is splurging on our inner struggles, on our battle in this world to bring God into this world, in order to explain that, the previous Rebbe introduces a statement from the Zohar. This statement from the Zohar is unpacked in literally hundreds of pages of Chassidus. It's literally one line, but it's unpacked in hundreds of pages, maybe more. And in this particular discourse, over the numerous chapters, he unpacks this little statement from the Zohar, all with the objective of telling us the level that God is willing to put himself out there for our success. And the statement to the Zohar goes like this. I'll say it in Hebrew, and then I'll translate it. Or Ein Sof, Lamata ad en tachlit, or Lamala ad en ketz, which means the infinite light, referring to God, the infinite light, is below to no conclusion and above to no end. That's the statement of the Zohar. The infinite light of God is below to no conclusion and above to no end. If you read this Zohar on its own, it's just a very simple statement describing God's infinite nature, that he expands to all directions. He's infinite, he goes up to no end and down to no end, because it expands everywhere. Nice statement. Chassidus unpacks this and says, hold on a second. You said three different things. You said, number one, the infinite light. Number two, you said, below to no conclusion. Number three, you said, above to no end. If you're trying to say that God is infinite, then that's what you should say. The infinite light, period. You've already covered everything. What is added by saying the next two statements? Below to no conclusion and above to no end. What's added by those two statements once you've already said, God is infinite? What's added? Once you say, or Ein Sof, once you say the light with no end, you're infinite, then you're infinite. There's nothing else to be said. What's added by then saying, oh, not only are you infinite, below to no end. Not only are you below to no end, you're also above to no end. It's redundancy. You're saying the same thing three times. Just say you're infinite, that's all. Or Ein Sof, the light with no end. Just stick there. So explains the previous Rebbe, no. There are actually three different statements being made here. Number one, we're saying God is infinite. Number two, we're saying God is below to no conclusion. And number three, we're saying God is above to no end. And what does that mean? So he explains. When you say infinite, if all we said about God is that the light expands to no end, if we stop there, then really nothing else exists. Nothing else can possibly exist in the face of infinite. You can't. If it's infinite, it's infinite. In other words, I cannot stand here and observe the infinite. Why can't I observe the infinite? Why not? Because if I'm observing the infinite, that means the infinite stops by me and I'm observing it. Then it's not infinite because it stopped here. There cannot be an anything in the face of infinite. There's just the infinite. There can't be an other. Once there's an other, thank you. Once there's an other, so that means the infinite stops. Here's the other, and the other is observing the infinite. That's not infinite anymore. Right? I can stand at the edge of the ocean and look at it because the ocean stops here. If the ocean expanded for infinity, I could not stand at the edge of the ocean and look at it because the ocean's expanding to infinity. I couldn't stand there and look at it. Right? It's the nature of infinite. You cannot look at it. Right? It's the same thing even with numbers. Numbers go on to infinity. But when exactly did you reach infinity? Never. Because you can always just add another number. Right? So we can't look at actual infinity. You can't. You have to look at a measured number at the end. And then you say, well, it's infinite because we could put another. Okay, but you're still not infinite because you could put another, and then another, and then another. Right? So we never actually look at infinite itself because we can't. Because if it's infinitely expanding, there is no me to look at it. So if you say, all we said was Or Ein Sof, the infinite light, then nothing else exists. And therefore comes the Zohar and says, the infinite light is below to no end. Below implies an other. There is something that's defined. There's a world. There's a space that exists. So there's an otherness already. And the Zohar is saying, you want to know the true nature of God's infinite? That it can even be in a lower. Ordinarily, infinite is stuck, cannot be seen or observed, because infinite is infinite, nothing else can be observed. But God's infinite is even beyond being infinite. And therefore, he can decide to take his infinite self and stick it into a little world. And that's what it means when it says that God's infinite is below to no end. That even as we go lower and lower into this little world in which we have tables and chairs and finite little things that live and die and grow and then decompose, all these small little limited things, his infinite self is invested in those tiny little lowly quote-unquote things. So that's a new statement the Zohar is teaching us. Your infinite nature is not just infinite, it actually extends even into low space, which ordinarily infinite shouldn't fit into space, but you do fit into space. How do you do that? Well, it's beyond us, because you're way beyond even infinite. Now that second statement becomes very deep. It's not just infinite, it's much more. The infinite is invested even in the tiniest of spaces. Clear so far? So we have two statements from the Zohar then. If God, you're infinite, you're beyond anything that we can possibly imagine. Then we say, your infinite self, which is beyond anything that can possibly be imagined, is to be found even in the lowest of places. And this is explained in the previous Rebbe's discourse at great length, in which he demonstrates how within creation we find certain elements of infinity. First of all, the fact that the universe is infinitely expanding. He doesn't say that, but he describes how there's infinite creation. And creation is constantly recreating itself. So even within our limited creation, we have infinite creation. Simple example. We are finite beings, right? We live for a certain amount of time and we live in a certain tiny little space. And yet within us, we have the potential for literally infinite progeny. We can give birth and then give birth again. They give birth and they give birth and they give birth and they give birth. So in my finite little self, there is literally infinite potential for life. And literally every single seed in the planet has that. The seed of an apple has the same thing. It has infinite potential for infinite apples to ever be produced. So even in the tiny little finite world, we have these like little infinites embedded. Right? So even though the world is finite, it's tiny, it's small, in there's God's infinite expressed. And he explains this on various different levels and how God's infinite nature is invested even in the tiniest of spaces in creation. Even in such spaces that are in opposition to God and deny God, if you look, you can find God there too. He uses the analogy of Pharaoh, who is the ultimate denier of God, who comes to Joseph to ask for Joseph's blessing. Like, that which is in opposition to God, acknowledging the truth of God. Right? We can find this in all kinds of ways, how God's infinite self is manifest even in our tiny little world. Okay. That's the subject of the last couple of years. This year, in chapter 15, the previous Rebbe discusses the third statement of the Zohar. Okay, be clear so far before we go forward? Yeah. Okay, so statement 1, God's infinite beyond everything. Statement 2, even in the lowly places, his infinite is there. Okay. Now the previous Rebbe addresses statement 3. You're above to no end. You're above to no end? How is that different than being infinite? Isn't that the same thing? Infinite, you're beyond everything. You're above to no end. Above to no end seems to be the exact same thing as saying you're infinite. When we say you're infinite and then we say you're below to no conclusion, okay, below is opposite to infinite. So we're stating this unique novelty that your infinite nature is in the lowly. Great. But then we said you're also above to no end. How is that different than being infinite? How is being above to no end different than just being infinite? Which is the third thing the Zohar says.
Well, is it infinite linear to begin with? Like infinite is like on a linear plane. And then
You're onto something, yeah.
Can't infinite be potential, and that's higher?
Similar. I'm going to explain how that's similar, but you guys are onto the right thing. That's correct. So let's explain that, yeah.
Infinity still includes the upper and the lower. Is it just giving it to us so that we here on this earth can understand?
Right, so you're saying that we here can understand, the notion of we here can understand is opposite to the notion of infinite. Because infinite is inherently incomprehensible. And the fact that we can understand it is itself the infinite choosing to stick itself into a tiny little place that you and I can understand. Right? In other words, because infinite in its abstract truth is not comprehensible. In the same way you can't observe the ocean, you can't. So the fact that you are saying, sorry?
That's why he uses the word up.
Exactly. Because in theory, infinite shouldn't say up and low.
But we can understand that.
Exactly. Which means, in addition to being infinite, which is incomprehensible, you're also below, which we are comprehensible now. But the infinite becomes comprehensible is itself the point. You're right. That's the meaning of he invests himself even in the lower, that little us can comprehend something of the infinite. Right? And now we have to look at the other statement, which is above to no end, which seems to be the same thing as infinite. Because infinite seems to be you're beyond everything, which is the statement above to no end. Okay, so both of you are onto something, and I just unpack what you just alluded to. When we say the word, the light with no end, if we say the light with no end, is that God himself in his very essence?
No, because God
Why not?
created the light.
Which means the light expands from somewhere. That's what you're saying by linear. The light expands from somewhere. So infinite is manifesting infinitely from somewhere. What's that thing it's manifesting from? From God himself. From the luminary, the ma'or in the Hebrew. The or versus the ma'or. The ma'or, the source. Now this source from which the infinite light expands, does it have to express infinite light? The sun doesn't have a choice. It's always going to shine light. It just doesn't have a choice. The same thing is true, by the way, of almost everything. There's this rule that Hasidus keeps on using, which is anything that's in potentia must manifest. Think of an artist. This is an analogy my father likes to use. A person who's an artist can't not paint. They have to. A person whose mode of expression is through singing, they can't not sing. Because if you have something inside of you, it's inevitable that's going to come out. It's inevitable. Sorry?
So it's not true. Sometimes you have to find the vessels to get it to come out. That's natural.
You have to find vessels to come out, to get them out. That's true, which we'll talk about shortly, but they still got to come out. They have to come out in some way. It's very difficult. It's like superhuman discipline to not express that which exists inside you. It's very difficult. It's the nature of evolution, actually. That whatever exists is going to reproduce itself. It's going to make more. It's going to keep on moving. It's the nature of reality, that whatever exists is going to manifest. So we're like compelled by forces that are almost bigger than us to manifest whatever we have. The sun is a classic example. It cannot choose to turn off. It's always going to shine. Okay. God himself, the source of the infinite light, does it have to shine that infinite light? Is God compelled to shine the infinite light? No, the answer is no, right? It's not compelled. He's not compelled to shine that infinite light. The language is, just like he can shine, he can also not shine. Okay, so describing God as the infinite expansion, we haven't got to his essence yet. We haven't got to his essence yet, because his essence can choose not to shine, not to expand, not to express, right? So now we say like this: the infinite light, which expands to no end, infinite, is also above to no end. Above doesn't mean beyond finite. Above means beyond being manifest. This infinite doesn't have to be infinite. It doesn't. It happens to be infinite, but it doesn't have to be infinite. So where do you find that? How do you find, where can you encounter God on this level where he doesn't have to be? It sounds like a tricky question.
Well, it's like a transfer of energy, right? So it's almost as though if you embrace him, then he will be present. If you don't, then it's because it's
right. So,
together.
Which means, therefore, I truly see the infinite nature of God where he doesn't express himself. when he doesn't express himself, now I know that he can even contain himself, which is beyond the sun, which can't contain itself because it has to shine. Infinite must continue shining, but God's not stuck in infinite. So if he's not stuck in infinite, A, he can be found in the lowliest of places. That was the previous point, that he's below to no end. And B, he can be completely concealed. Does not need to be expressed or manifest or revealed. So God not being present is a deeper truth of God than him being present. Ironically. Because him being present is just infinite, and infinite expands onto infinity. So you're always going to be present. But then when he says, oh no, I'm not present actually, you're here. Now we're talking about God on the most deep infinite, that even some other can exist, me and you. So if me and you could say, I'm here and I want, means that God's putting his infinite nature aside and saying, you can exist. And that's the true expression of God's infinite nature, that he can also contain himself. Following? Okay. I'm going to repeat it in a second. You want to ask a question? Is it relevant to...
Yeah,
Go ahead.
it's relevant. Like in my mind, I'm thinking about the nature of light, and light, like you're saying, is a creation in my perception that was created, and then there was light. God said,
Yeah.
may there be light, and
Yeah. Okay, when I say the infinite light, we don't mean literal light physically. I should have made that clear at the beginning.
yeah.
We don't mean physical light. It's a metaphor to describe that which is like infinitely expanding. But even the word expanding fails us, because when we use the word expanding, we mean space. This is obviously beyond spatial, but we have no other words but to use that.
But but the first day was not a regular natural light. The natural light came on the first day, right, of creation.
What do you mean?
Yeah, the sun came on the fourth day of creation, yeah? Okay, yeah.
So if light is a creation, then yes, God is everywhere, and he allowed light to be everywhere, but God is not necessarily light.
Right, so again, we're using the light, we're using the word light metaphorically, not literal physical light, to describe a notion, an idea of infinite manifestation. Okay?
Energy is a better word.
It's just, the word light is being used as a description, as a metaphor to describe infinite manifestation. Energy, if you want to call it that. It's not literal physical light. There's no space in which the light should shine. Okay, you'll take one more question and I'll just recap what we said so make it clear for everybody, yeah? What do you want to say?
I'm not quite sure, but if for example, if we all believe, I believe, I don't even know where I got it from, that we all have the essence of God within our own neshama.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, it's kind of similar to that. It can either be contained or expressed or found.
This is where we're going.
Is that
Very good.
Sort of like,
This is where we're going, very good.
But you mentioned that,
Yeah.
that either we exist or Hashem exists. Why is it either or?
If God were, so to speak, trapped in the trappings of infinite, then we couldn't exist.
Exactly.
So if we exist, it's because God's beyond infinite and saying, I'm making space for you.
You're making space.
So God can only contain himself and make space if he's also beyond infinite.
Is he making space or creating us?
Well, first he makes space and then he creates inside. That's one of the statements of the Zohar, that God hides himself and then creates. Right? So God contains himself to even make a space for the notion of us to even exist.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me recap quickly.
It's like contained. Yeah.
Yes, containing yourself, exactly. Exactly. What you don't say is sometimes deeper you than what you do say. Exactly. Exactly. Exactly right. So we're going to use that metaphor in just a second. Exactly right. Okay, so let's recap what we have so far, and then we'll use this metaphor to understand it a little better. This analogy. So statement one is, God is infinite. Infinite means nothing else exists. Statement one. Statement two, this infinite can be found even in the smallest of places. So that's statement number two. Statement number three is, this infinite, if it decides to, can contain itself and be finite to allow you and me to exist. It's not stuck, as it were, in being infinite. And that is above to no end. Because God not being is actually higher than God being. God expressing himself is lower than God containing himself. And that's where this metaphor comes in. 1 second. This is where the metaphor comes in. The language he uses actually is a teacher and student, but we can use parent-child for the same purposes. So there's three stages. There's the parent as the parent sees life itself. That's infinite compared to the child. The child's view of the world is tiny. My view of the world, comparatively speaking, is infinite. Okay. Now I cannot communicate to my kid the infinite view I have of the world. It's just not going to happen. Okay. So I have to do two things. Number one, I have to stop thinking in my infinite way of thinking. So I have to contain myself hold back my infinite way of thinking, put it all aside, and make space for the kid's way of thinking. And then I can communicate to the kid in little language, and hopefully some of my infinite thinking comes into the tiny space. And those are the three things. Number one, I'm infinite, I'm beyond the kid. Number two is I have to use language for the kid, so I have to take my infinite thinking, put it into a tiny space for the kid. But in order to do that, I have to, first of all, remove my infinite thinking. And that's me being beyond expressing myself. It's me not expressing myself, which is an even greater version of me than the expression of myself, that which I'm not saying. Right? It's true in everything. Like if you have a feeling you want to express, so there's the feeling itself, which is maybe beyond words, and then there is, okay, so the feeling itself is beyond words, but then I have to say it, so I got to use words. So what expresses my feelings, the words, yes, but the words are only like me taking the infinite feeling and stuffing them into a tiny space that hopefully the person on the other end can understand. But what I'm not saying actually says more about what I'm feeling than what I do say, because I can't really say it, it's too big.
It almost takes more energy to do that than otherwise.
That's right. And the objective, hopefully, is that the person on the receiving end knows how to listen to what you're saying and hear that which you're also not saying.
That's why it's good for husbands who don't talk, right?
As the only male here, I'm going to say it works both ways. I'm kidding.
The minute you use the word
Containing
Yeah.
themselves, they're containing
the word
not
infinity,
Yep,
you're already confining it.
exactly. Which is why the Zohar has to keep on going. It can't just say infinity. It's got to say infinity, but also below to no end and above to no end. That's why it has to add those statements. Because it's not stuck at infinity. The infinity can descend into the lowest place and contain itself to no end, to the point where it's almost not visible, or actually completely not visible.
I'm putting my seatbelt back on.
Why?
Right?
We can't receive it. We can't receive it.
There we go.
We don't receive it.
We
You're
do,
part-
we have-
We're part of it. It's not even something.
No,
that
but
we
there's
can-
a.
If you and I are aware of our reception of it, and if you and I are aware and talking about it, it's because it's been contained.
Exactly.
If it's not contained, you and I cannot talk about it. It's like standing at the edge of the ocean and looking at it only because the ocean stops here. If the ocean keeps on going, I can't stop and look at it because there's nowhere for me to stand. So if the infinite
But
presence, right?
It exists whether we think about it. or not.
Yes.
Yes, and if you can think about it, and if you can think, period, I'll add it this way. If you can think about something other than God, it's because God contained himself. How could you possibly think about anything other than God if God's the only reality? How are you allowed to even do that? It's only because God says, I'm going to contain myself and allow you to think whatever you want. Even if it's opposite to me. We can literally sit here and talk about things that are opposite to God. And we can only do that because God says, I'm going to contain. You do what you want.
That's Simpson.
That's Tzimtzum. So Tzimtzum is greater than, or the containment is greater than the expression. And the expression itself contains an element of restraint. The expression itself contains restraint.
I just
It's
want
like
Right?
a black hole that has so much light that
It has to go inward.
withdraw.
That's right. So the going inward is more expressive of me than the going outward. So God down to no end is one level, but then God containing himself to no end, that's an even deeper level. That's the goes above. Is that somewhat clear?
I just
Okay.
want to make sure I understand that God exists, that God exists
Yeah.
everywhere, right?
Yeah.
And the Tzimtzum, it's not that he's not there, that he contains himself, but that he is there because we wouldn't be able to exist without him,
Right.
but he is not in full expression.
Exactly. So the tzimtzum is not that he's not there. The concealment is not that he's not there. The concealment is that he's there in such a way that he's concealed. So the fact that he's there in such a way that he's concealed is even deeper than him just being there. Because him just being there would mean none of us are here. Him being there in a way that he's concealed, now you and I are here. And we can think, we can have ideas, and sometimes even challenge his presence.
The same way you influence your children as a parent, even when you're not there, they still have your.
If you're properly communicating,
Yeah.
exactly. If you're properly communicating that which you're not saying, then even when you're not saying it, they know what you're saying. Exactly. That's correct.
But they have free choice to disobey.
That's just like you and I have free choice to disobey. Exactly right. Our children could disobey us and we can disobey God. Exactly.
They hear us.
That's right.
We're not there.
That's right. So this says the previous Rebbe. Everything I'm saying is the previous Rebbe is chapter 15 as explained by the Rebbe in 1965.
Wow.
So what happens here then, said the previous Rebbe, is this is the treasure that God is revealing to us. Treasures, the nature of treasure is to be concealed. That's the nature of a treasure. And now we're splurging it. So what does it mean God's splurging his treasure? So what's happening is we are being allowed to know, and we're being exposed to the idea through Chassidus and through Torah, that God's not being there is actually the deepest him. His not being there is the deepest him. When we understand that, then nothing gets in the way of what we have to get done. Anything that gets in the way of us doing what we need to do to serve God properly is, from our perspective, God's not there, so I can't do it. And then we're learning God's not there, so you can't do it. God's not there is because he is there. And the objective of him, quote unquote, not being there is for you to discover him. So now the secret's been exposed. We already know he's there. So now all of a sudden the obstacles that we thought were obstacles are no longer obstacles. Because why should they be? The whole thing of you not being there was you the whole time. All for the purpose of me being able to see you, actually. Because if you were not containing yourself, I couldn't see anything. So now that you contained yourself, you were gracious enough to contain yourself to allow me to be here and discover you. So even when I don't see you, I know it's you. So the game is up. What's the expression? Sorry? The game is up. Right? The whole game.
Something is up. I know what you're talking about.
Right?
Game is up.
Yeah, we're like the whole charade is up.
That's right.
You're marching around as if like you're hiding and you're trying to make us look for you and all the rest of it. And now we're learning, God's revealing the deepest truth that he was never hiding for you to find him. That was him expressing himself to you by containing himself so you can be there and interact with him.
It's like the name of the parsha.
What? What'd you say?
Va'ira reveals himself? Yeah. Well, actually, it is linked a little bit because God talks about different names and what those names mean. Yeah, but that's very, very good. Okay. So if you circle back to the beginning, where the inner battle was, I have this version of myself which says, I exist, I want, give me, take me. Well, give me, I want this, I like this, I don't like that. Which veers from the straight and narrow discipline to doing what you have to. And the objective was to take that attitude and use it for, I am 100% committed to God, even beyond what's normal and what's straight and narrow. That transfer can happen because I know the fact that I feel like I want, I this, I that, is only because he concealed himself, which was really him the whole time. So even the very sense that I have of self, I want and I this, is in truth his greatest expression. To allow me to be me so that I can in turn find him. And that's the best way to transfer. Sorry? Precisely. Exactly. And then now we have a relationship. And now I can take all the energy of the self, which is the result of your concealment, and use it for you. Because that whole concealment the whole time was you communicating to me. That is, in a nutshell, an overview of what I would say most of Chabad people are busying their brain with right now, is understanding this chapter. What does this mean that God's concealing himself to no end and revealing himself to no end? This is what everybody's busy talking about in the last few weeks and leading up to the 10th of Shvat next week. As we study these two discourses with Rabbi Unpacked, chapter 15, which as you can see is a very heavy and weighty chapter. So I hope that was somewhat clear. It's very mystical, very philosophical. Tried my best to give it language that we can understand. I tried to conceal it, I guess. That would be the metaphor, so that it can be understood. And thank you for the opportunity.